Hey everybody, tonight's video is called Why Wear an Ox Yoke? And tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Jeremiah. We're going to be looking at Jeremiah wearing an ox and ox yoke. And you might think it's a funny kind of picture for a man to be wearing the ox's yoke, but we're going to see the reason behind it. So Jeremiah chapter 27 verse 1 starts out, "In the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, the word came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying." So this is most likely referring to Jehoiakim right around the year of 609 to 608 BC in Seton, or possibly some will argue that the correct reading would be Zedekiah, which would put a date as of the offset of his 597 to 596 campaign. And the rest of the chapter is going to make it seem like Zedekiah is the correct attribution. And so many, scholars argue that this is a scribal error, probably coming from the similarity between the opening of this chapter and the last chapter. And the entire verse is missing actually in the Greek Old Testament. In verse 2 and 3 it says, "Thus says the Lord to me, make for yourselves bonds and yokes and put them on your neck, and send them to the king of Edom, the king of Moab, the king of the Ammonites, the king of Tyre, and the king of Sidon, by the hand of the messengers who come to Jerusalem, to Zedekiah, king of Judah." So we see an object lesson here, and it symbolized bondage to Babylon. And the yoke was bound on Jeremiah's neck to picture Judah's captivity, and then sent to 6 kings of the nearby nations who would also be under Babylon's power. And Jeremiah also performed a sign act visibly depicting his message in chapters 13 and chapters 19. And in verse 3 we see send word, in the Hebrew has send them, which may suggest that the prophet is to send yokes to each of one of the envoys. And Edom and Sidon, as in Jeremiah 25 verse 21 and 22, they are nations under the Lord's judgment as well. And the envoys probably came to discuss rebellion and league with Egypt against Nebuchadnezzar. And bonds were leather straps to secure the yokes. And the yokes were wood. The yokes were wood that went under and above the neck of large animals so that the beast could pull a plow. And we'll see in the next chapter that Jeremiah wore the yoke in public because Hananiah broke it. In verse 4 through 8 says, "And command them to say to their masters, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, thus you shall say to your masters, I will have made the earth, the man and the beast that are on the ground by my great power and by my outstretched arm, and have given it to whom it seemed proper to me. And now I have given it all the lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. My servant and the beast of the field I have also given to him to serve him. So all nations shall serve him and his son's son until the time of the land comes. And then many nations and great kings shall make him serve them. And it shall be that the nation and kingdom which will not serve Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and which will not put its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, that nation I will punish, says the Lord, with the sword, with the famine, and with the pestilence, until I have consumed them by his hand." So with an argument from creation, the Lord claims rights over all nations. And in verse 6, even the mighty Nebuchadnezzar must do the Lord's bidding. And the Lord would even make the wild animals obey Nebuchadnezzar, putting him in a position like Adam before the fall. And he would remain in power over them, and he would do it because God gave it to him. And I know that the election is coming up here in just like 5 days on Tuesday next week. But take note that God has already ordained who is going to be the winner to be our 47th United States president, regardless if it's Trump or Harris. And we see that God appoints people to their positions. And you can find that even in Daniel chapter 2, I believe, right around verses 20 through 24. And his son and grandson, in verse 7, it spoke of his chosen successors, not necessarily physical offspring. And the point of the object lesson in verse 8 is simple, that any nation that will serve Babylon willingly may stay in their own land, but the nations that won't submit voluntarily to Babylon will suffer destruction. And consequently, Judah should submit and not be removed from the land. In verse 9 through 11 says, "Therefore do not listen to your prophets, your diviners, your dreamers, your soothsayers, and your sorcerers who speak to you, saying, you shall serve the king of Babylon. For they prophesy a lie to you, to remove you far from the land, and I will drive you out, and you will perish. But the nations that bring their necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve him, I will let them remain in their own land, says the Lord, and they shall till it and dwell in it." So just like Judah's kings, the surrounding nations' kings had false prophets and sorcerers like those forbidden in Israel back in Leviticus chapter 19 verse 26 and Deuteronomy chapter 18 verse 10 and 11. And in verse 11, all could still avoid total exile by accepting God's judgment of submission to Babylon. And the Lord is the one who will decide whether they stay in the land or they go into exile. And it is often best for us to submit to the difficult yoke that is imposed on us. And in verse 12 through 15, I also spoke to Zedekiah, king of Judah, according to all these words, saying, bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve him and his people and live. Why will you die, you and your people, by the sword, by the famine, and by the pestilence, as the Lord has spoken against the nation who will not serve the king of Babylon? Therefore do not listen to the words of the prophets who speak to you, saying, you shall serve the king of Babylon, for they prophesy a lie to you. For I have not sent them, says the Lord, yet they prophesy a lie in my name, that I may drive you out, and that you may perish, you and the prophets who prophesy before you. So Jeremiah, he's pleading with Judah to accept the dominion by Babylon and the exile of some of its leaders like Jehoiachin and others taken in 597 BC as part of God's plan for her ultimate salvation. And all should serve the king of Babylon in order to avoid an even worse fate. And in verse 15, we see that while God did not send these false prophets to speak on his behalf, yet he was also not stopping them. He allowed them to do what they wanted to do. And he allowed them so that the people and the rulers of Judah would have a genuine choice between the false and the true. And if they chose the false, God would use it to drive them out of the land to perish, both the people and the prophets. In verse 16-17, it says, also I spoke to the priests and to all this people, saying, thus says the Lord, do not listen to the words of your prophets who prophesy to you, saying, behold, the vessels of the Lord's house will now shortly be brought back to Babylon, for they prophesy a lie to you. Do not listen to them. Serve the king of Babylon and live. Why should this city be laid waste? So this was a falsely optimistic message of the lying prophets of Jeremiah's time. And they said that the temple vessels that Nebuchadnezzar carried away the earlier invasions would soon be brought back to the temple. And their optimism was a lie, and they should have simply surrendered to God's judgment instead of hoping for deliverance from the Babylonians. And failure to surrender will bring worse judgment on Jerusalem, like a child who may resist a spanking. It's going to result in further chastisement. And if you were that kid, you knew that your parents were going to get you back even extra. And verse 18 says, "But if they are prophets, and if the word of the Lord is with them, let them know, make intercession on to the Lord of hosts, that the vessels which are left in the house of the Lord, in the house of the king of Judah, and in Jerusalem, do not go to Babylon." So God would not answer such a prayer, as we're going to see in the upcoming verses of 19 through 22. And this revealed his indifference to the prayers of those false prophets and those who claim to be prophets that could and should be tested. And what they said shouldn't be blindly accepted, but God proposed a simple test for the lying prophets to pray, asking that the vessels remain in Jerusalem and do not go to Babylon. And this was the same kind of test that Elijah brought to the prophets of Baal back in 1 Kings chapter 18. And these vessels were eventually carried off in 605 BC, as seen in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, and some in 597 BC, as seen in 2 Kings 24:13. And they were brought back to the temple as part of the return in the days of King Cyrus, back in Ezra chapter 1, verse 7 through 11, which occurred 70 years later, not shortly after they are taken to Babylon. And in verse 19 through 22, as promised, "For thus says the Lord of hosts concerning the pillars, concerning the sea, concerning the carts, and concerning the remainder of the vessels that remain in the city, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, did not take, when he carried away captive Jeconiah, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from Jerusalem to Babylon, and all the nobles of Judah and Jerusalem. Yes, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, concerning the vessels that remain in the house of the Lord, and in the house of the king of Judah and of Jerusalem. They shall be carried to Babylon, and there they shall be until the day that I visit them, says the Lord. Then I will bring them up and restore them to this place." So they were among the valuables associated with the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had not yet taken. And at the time of Jeremiah's prophecy, they still remained in or at the temple. And Lord willing, as we're going to see New Year's Eve as we wrap up this book, the bronze pillars were damaged and taken to Babylon in Jeremiah 52, verse 17. And there's no mention of the Ark of the Covenant. And some will argue that Nebuchadnezzar carried away in one of his early invasions of Jerusalem with the other temple treasures of 2 Chronicles 26, verse 7. But there are Jewish legends that say Jeremiah hid the Ark of the Covenant before they could be captured by the Babylonians. And Jeconiah was carried away in verse 20, right around 598 BC, in the second of the third invasions of Nebuchadnezzar. And then he took all the nobles in Judah, or of Judah and Jerusalem, but left some of the temple treasures behind. And in verse 21-22, Jeremiah revealed that the temple, the Judah's vessel temples, were taken to Babylon to be restored to the temple. And that would be fulfillment right around 536 BC, as spoken about in Ezra chapter 5, verse 13 through 15. And around 516 to 515 BC, those articles were replaced, or they were placed in the rebuilt temple, as seen in Ezra chapter 6, verse 15. And in verse 19, we see the term the sea. And that was a large bronze tank containing the water for the priests to wash in, as seen in 2 Chronicles 4, verse 2. And it represents the Lord's victories over the forces of chaos, which were symbolically calmed and placed within the Lord's house. So to wrap up today's video, we look tonight at the yoke and the bonds, with opening with the command to make them. And in verse 4 to 8, we get the message associated with the bonds and the yokes. And verse 9 through 11 shows not to believe the lying prophets. And while speaking on yoke, I want to point out the one aspect of the good news of the new covenant is that we have a different but a better yoke. And what I mean by that is I want to look at Matthew chapter 11. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 and 29 and 30. So Matthew 11, 28 through 30 says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." So Jesus is our gentle and lowly, and he's the yoke we need to take on for ourselves. In verse 12 through 15 is the message to King Zedekiah. In verse 16 and 17 shows us what the lying prophets said about the temple vessels. And verse 18 shows that the test of the prophets regarding the temple vessels. And the chapter, it ends with the fate of the temple vessels. We spoke about also today theories of the Ark of the Covenant, and I want to go over to the book of Revelation chapter 19. So Revelation chapter, it's actually chapter 11, verse 9. So I got my references mixed up here. Revelation chapter 11, verse 19. And it says, "Then the temple of God was opened in heaven, and the ark of his covenant was seen in his temple. And there were lightnings, noises, thunderings, an earthquake, and great hail." So one of the most common theories on what happened to the Ark of the Covenant is that God brought it to heaven based off John's revelation here in Revelation chapter 11, verse 19. And that's going to wrap up today's video. We'll see you next on Saturday. We're going to be doing a topical study on Saturday. So I hope that you have a great rest of your week, and God bless, and we'll see you back on Saturday.